And we are gathered on the traditional lands of Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We are also acknowledging our water as sourced from Shoal Lake First Nation. My understanding of a treaty is that it's not just made at one point in time, but it's lived in relationship. And so I'm happy to welcome you all this evening to hear Dr. Priscilla Settee, who will teach us about relationships in a world that's been turned upside down. And now I'd like to call on Roger Siskin to introduce the speaker.
Maybe I'll use the mic. Hi. Yes, I guess it is working. So I am very pleased to have been given the privilege of introducing my daughter-in-law, Priscilla Settee, to my Ujbo family, to my friends, and to my own family who are here tonight. Thank you all for coming. Priscilla has been my daughter-in-law for almost 40 years, a partner to my youngest son, Len. She has become an integral member of the extended Waldarski Sisters family. In fact, she and Len are in Winnipeg today to attend our family annual Hanukkah celebration, which was held this past Saturday night. During these 40 years, Priscilla and I have developed a very close relationship, challenging each other, exploring new ideas, new insights into old ideas, and of course there's always the current political world situation to worry about. More than that, ours has been a reciprocal relationship, learning about our different cultures, Indigenous history, culture, and traditions, and the Jewish history and traditions, learning about our differences, but also our similarities, particularly about the current problems within our two communities. Priscilla continues to amaze me. She is so multifaceted. She not only continues to challenge herself, but she challenges me in so many different ways. And particularly, she challenges her own community to build bridges, to make linkages with other disadvantaged communities, not only in Canada, but around the world. In her spare time, she has managed to get her PhD in Indigenous Studies, and soon after became a full professor at the University of Saskatchewan. The accolades from her students have been truly amazing to me. She has traveled the world doing research for her 4 published books. She has presented papers at various conferences in many exotic parts of the world, focusing on topics ranging from food sovereignty, Indigenous Women's Network, Indigenous environmental issues. She is currently a member of COT, the Canadian Union of University Teachers. And I would recommend that you read the Ujbo's blurb on Priscilla's full career. Perhaps her greatest accomplishments, and could it be that I am really biased, is her role as a mother. That is, of course, with a little help from Len. She is the mother to Mika, my beautiful granddaughter, and a kukum to my great-grandchildren, Naya and Lola, our pride and joy. And now I am proud to introduce Priscilla.
So I'd like to welcome everybody here to Treaty 3. Treaty 1. I'm from Treaty 3. So I know some of you here through Rose and the Siskin clan, and others I met along the way. So, and some I haven't met yet, but no doubt our paths will cross. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 30 minutes. And what I'm going to do is for 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about my own personal background, early influences, my own personal frame of reference, just to give you an idea of, the rest. And then I'm going to spend 10 minutes on my current work in the community. And then I'm going to spend the last 7 or so minutes on current work, some of the organizations that I work with, and giving us a cause for optimism in a very sometimes bleak world. So I'm going to start with the 1970s when I was a young adult. And well, before that, just before that, my own family is a hunting and trapping family that comes from a hunting and trapping community in northern Saskatchewan. And through a set of circumstances that is not dissimilar from a lot of my people, our family, my dad served in the First World War, and he came back to Canada and was immediately declared civilized because he had served in World War I. And what that meant was he was taken off his lands and forced to live in the city away from his traditional economic base. And within a few short years, our entire family was disintegrated through, circumstances that are, I think, representative of situations of underdevelopment and lack of support for families in new settings. And so all of us were taken away as little kids. There were 6 of us, and I'm the last one standing. So I'm the second youngest of 6 children, and as I said, they have all passed on. Not through the most pleasant circumstances. I had 2 brothers pass away in jail in Saskatoon, and another sister that was killed in a car accident under odd circumstances, and another sister that they weren't sure whether she had committed suicide, but it was definitely related to the upbringing that she had received. I had 2 brothers that were put in the same home, and at one point there was a very abusive home, and one of my friend's father happened to come to the farm and see these 2 boys tied to a tree and getting whipped. And these are stories that are very moving, but not too dissimilar from a lot of our people whose stories were interrupted by colonialism. So that's my background, and I had a lot of people along the way help me. I have to say that. I had gone to the first Native Studies department in Canada, which was in southern Ontario, and there I met young people like myself at that time that were really looking to change the world. And in the 70s, things, I know there are a lot of people from the 70s in this room, and things were a lot different then. Things were exciting, things were very radical in some cases, music, politics, all of that. And I really think it helped to form our worldview that life could be a lot better for those of us that bothered to seek out those answers. And so I work with a lot of young Native people from throughout Canada, and at the time the big issue was the James Bay Dam. And so I remember I worked with this one Jewish fellow, Norman Zlotkin was his name, he's still a friend today, and I remember walking on the bridge that separated New York, Quebec, and Ontario. And that was when we met, and we're still friends today, and we always talk about that time when we were, standing up to the big developers and all of that meant, and making linkages with, people who were concerned about the environment and the land. And he later he was a lawyer, and he later established a legal relationship, business partnership with a Northern Cree woman, Iliaropikiku. And they called their law firm, in joking manner, Bagels and Bannock, so that was kind of cute. Anyway, he's still around. He became my colleague at the College of Law at our university years later. In the late 70s, I worked with indigenous tribals in Latin America. And it was after a teaching stint that I did in northern Saskatchewan at South End Reindeer. And I was really struck by how this community of South End Reindeer, amidst so much beauty, had so much oppression and poverty. And I was probably early 20s at that time, and I can remember feeling like a bit perplexed by how could we have so much social issues in such a beautiful part of the world. So I decided to pack up my bags and go down to Latin America, and I made connections with tribals down there, and in searching out some of the answers to those political questions, I found not only answers, but I also found that living conditions were even more stark. Like there was murders of Indigenous people that were just standing up for their land rights and just really, fighting for human rights. So it totally politicized me about how far certain states would go to keep control on land and resources and keep really Indian people in their places. So today, during the 70s, I was part of Indigenous women's local, provincial, and national organizing bodies. And we worked on issues like family violence. We set up the first solar-powered house in Prince Albert to help help women that were fleeing domestic violence, women and children. We also had a racist judge removed from the bench. He was, a friend of ours was a legal aid lawyer, and he said, Priscilla, you have to read these transcripts, they're just horrible. This judge is getting away with murder. He's just wholesale throwing people into jail and being racist and ugly about it. So I went through the transcripts and I said, you're right, we're going to remove this guy. And it took a year or so, but we did. We had him removed, and that was again another victory for people. He was saying things like, I consider it good legal judge work or police work if a policeman stops an Indian kid with a new bike. Or, kid, where did you steal that bike from? Like, it was just really disparaging remarks. So even, we had him removed under the Provincial Court Act, I think it was. But again, it was another victory. And the next victory we had was the closure of P4W. Prison for Women was this huge dungeon-like albatross jail in Kingston. And during the year prior, or the years prior to when we had it closed down, through the offices of the National Native Women's Organization, 13 young Cree women from our prairie provinces either hanged themselves or were killed in prison. And we said, this has got to stop. And if anybody's going to stop it, it'll be us. And we did. And we closed down P4W. And as a result, there were a handful of smaller, I guess, healing lodges, they're called. Well, I'm all for not only, prison reform, but for prison abolishment. And certainly one of my great mentors on that was the late Claire Culhane, that some of you might remember, who was a friend of our family's. And I learned a lot from Claire during that time, but I also learned a lot from Angela Davis, who today is still a prison abolitionist. And we've spent time together in talking about, how the prison industrial complex really impacts people of color and people who live in poverty. I also spent time with the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and Judy Rebick remains one of my very close friends. As you know, she's a rabble-rouser that really gets things done and is really a radical, a visionary that really had a lot to contribute to the National Action Committee when she was president, and I think I was treasurer. Later, I did a stint with the Canada World Youth Group, and I gave a talk at noon today, and I was saying how in Canada World Youth, it taught us to be internationalists, to see ourselves within a larger world picture, and working with youth and having them understand their role in social change and internationalism. was a really instructive time in my district. Here in Winnipeg, where we lived for 6 years, Len and I and our daughter, I helped coordinate the Children of the Earth school here. And again, that was not a giveaway, that was something that we locked horns with the school division, Winnipeg 1. And you know, we did it because our kids were being maltreated, our kids were being failed by the systems, and they were paying large sums of money to be put in the schools, to be ignored. If we could carry them over till January, they could get their second installment of money from the community and they would disappear. And Helen Settee, my colleague and relative here, was one of those early educators who really helped make a difference in the establishment of Children of the Earth and of Nichimakwa. So, you know, these are victories that we established along the way that need to be talked about and documented in the hopes of replicating, because survival schools all through North America were really a wonderful way of helping parents who needed help in the schooling of their children, but also changing structures of resistance, of colonialism, of everything like that that stood in the way of equality. Later on in that decade, our family was very instrumental with the South African Congress of Trade Unions, where we dismantled apartheid through solidarity. We worked with the trade unions in Canada and South Africa. We boycotted South African wines. We did our work, and one day, you know, Nelson Mandela was freed, and South Africa was also freed from apartheid. Even though it wasn't perfect, it's still not perfect. It is still a movement forward. Some of the early influences that affected me greatly were scholars like Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire, and of course Angela Davis, and how they impacted my own ability to understand the world was by a deep, deep analysis of colonialism and imperialism and racism, anti-racism. And Angela Davis, if you haven't read her, I would really encourage you to read her autobiography. A friend of mine, when I was being very perplexed by some of the personal conditions in our communities, you know, their lateral violence and poverty and all of that. And sometimes you really need to look deep into analysis on why it exists and how to deal with it. And Angela Davis, in her autobiography, talked about a lot of those conditions and how to deal with it and how to understand it for change. So today, I work at the Department of Indigenous Studies, and you know, in higher learning, like, we develop knowledge, that's our job. We research, we work with amazing colleagues both in the department but also other departments. And my good colleague Jim Silver is here. I've worked with Jim over the years in a number of roles, and you know, it's really a gift to be given the friendship and collegiality of people like Jim. Jim has worked tirelessly in this community. He is one of the big responsible people for the development on Selkirk Avenue. Jim, what's it called? The commercial hotel that was transformed into a student residence. And you know, these are hopeful stories that people in your community, our community, have really fought the system in a good way and established something that really meant a difference to people who live in the margins. So we need to celebrate those moments and those people. And Len and I worked with a lot of those wonderful people, John Loxley, that taught us a lot, and I could name a lot of people, Larry Morissette, the Morissette brothers. Like, there's a lot of heroes locally here. So some of the work that I have done in the department, and I'm not trying to toot my horn, but just to help understand that this work is possible, and it's possible with deep linkages into community. Myself and two people from College of Law and the Department of English established a gang exiting project, and it was a three-year project that helped gangsters stay out of trouble, get out of the gangs, and get to partake in some university activities. And it was a really wonderful learning experience because it had gang-related men and women working with some of our students from English and law, and with some of our high school students from the survival school in Saskatoon. And we had them write the curriculum so that they were engaged in learning what they wanted to learn. And of course we guided them. But we wrote 3 articles on that project, and it was a learning experience for all of us, very hopeful. And today, some of the gangsters work with Len in some of the social, the build-up community that he's helped organize in the city of Saskatoon. So a lot of our work intersects, and is hopeful. Today, let's see, some of the research issues I work on with Indigenous women focus on social economies. And social economies, some of you will understand that are economics from a different perspective. Jim has written a lot on it through CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and other people have written a lot on it. Len in his practices social economies. And they're an alternative way at looking at economic development. The non-sort of capitalist approach to community development from the ground up. We see in today's current model of development under capitalism is that, it's all done for profit and never mind what is happening to people on the ground. And it's a development model that has created environmental change that will never be the same. It's destroyed a lot of the planet, and certainly my research on trappers' economies and social economy projects point to that. Like, the facts are there. We are leaving this world in a really tough shape, and it's only going to change if we address it in higher learning, in the classrooms. Like, these are things that should be taught to kids, in various forms at a very early age. And I'll always remember the time when we were in Cuba, and the exciting thing about Cuba was that all these little kids, the pioneers, like, they understood from a very early age their role in building strong societies. And they were taught, like, social responsibility and where food comes from, and just things that you think kids can't comprehend, but they definitely do. Those little children, I remember I was in 1 year in Libya, and we saw these pioneers from Cuba going through the streets with wheelbarrows full of vegetables that they had grown. And it was very exciting. Whatever you think of Libya and Cuba and the international order. So my latest publication is on food systems, and it's a story of 15 communities across Canada that have taken food control in their own hands, gone back to traditional knowledge systems, or adapted to new ones. Because as some of you may be aware, food sources in northern communities are really desperate. We have people dying of preventable diseases, some of it water related, a lot of it food related. A lot of the food insecurity, of course, comes from development that is just out of control in terms of local control. So in my province, I know better than most other provinces, is, we're just seeing huge clear cuts, mining, development solely for the corporate sector, and nothing left behind for the people, maybe a few poorly paid jobs. So, let's see. So today I work also with Seed Change Canada, and Seed Change Canada is an amazing organization based out of Ottawa, but we also do massive fundraising for to support projects in other parts of the world where there's food insecurity. And we encourage and support seed gathering, like on a very large level. We support local farmers and women's groups to maintain food sovereignty within their communities. And that's a very exciting, and this project, Seed Safe Canada, used to be run by, in its original form, by Lotta Hitchmanova. Do you remember hearing about Lotta? So I forget the name of that organization, but we morphed it into Seed Canada to focus more on food and less on where she was. Like, she was about reducing poverty, but we took it to a different level and focus today more on food. And we have a national board that does work all over the world. And again, I like to talk about these organizations because they represent hope. They are doing good in the world, and they're saving biodiversity. And no doubt, because we've lost over 1 million species of our biodiversity in the last 100 years, and we are losing, I think it said, 200 species a day. And this is alarming when you think of it, but if you look around the world, you can understand why that's happening, and that if it's going to change, it's because every citizen is activated in a small or large way. In 2020, David Suzuki picked me to be one of his research fellows and gave me the gift of researching my own community and the impact that development and climate change had on my parents' traditional hunting and gathering grounds. So that was a very interesting project that is downloadable from the website. This year I've been granted a Rockefeller Foundation grant, and it's kind of ironical to think that a multi-trillionaire like the Rockefeller Foundation family would actually give Native project money, but again, it's a sign of the times where philanthropy is saying, maybe we've got something to learn from Indigenous peoples. And so they put a call out for project proposals, and hundreds of these proposals came in, including one of ours, and we were the 1 in 10 projects that were granted some money to start putting our energies towards what's going to make food security for your community. So we're working in Treaty 4 around that. And then this year I had the great honor of being chosen to be an Indian Collective Fellow. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the fellowship of the Indian Collective. And I remember I was looking on the website, just getting ready for this talk, and there was a sign of a demonstration site, and this one young woman was carrying a sign, and it said, "Climate change. There is no economy on a dead planet." And I thought that was kind of a brilliant reminder that, what's happening in Canada today. Look what's happening in BC with the floods and the mudslides and the loss of life and the fires and the flood, like just mayhem. And this is not, as we're aware, not a singular, event. This is the future. And you think of that, we think of our grandchildren and the future, and we say, in the spaceship Earth, there is no passengers, we are all crew. And this means that we have work to do. Each of us needs to be engaged in that. And I know people in this room that are really taking that seriously and looking at personal lifestyles, but also political, larger political situations. So all of this has meant some very grievous suffering for if you're Indigenous. So the state has really put us, the activists, in 2 camps. One is criminalization for anybody that stands up to the state. And I'm talking about what happened at Wet'suwet'en in BC. And I've got a quote, a letter that was signed by the traditional chiefs there. When they signed a letter, all of the hereditary chiefs signed it. And I just want to read a little bit from that letter. The hereditary chiefs are seeking to protect clean waters and waterways, clean air in Yinta for today and for generations to come. We are outraged. We are outraged by yesterday's immense RCMP resources allocated to remove the water protectors, who are all women, by the way, at a time of natural disasters and displacements of many in the ancestral homelands south of us. RCMP choose to enforce a rescue mission of the camp workers whom have shared that we were not aware of the eviction notice, otherwise they would have left the camp. We have expressed our concern about the Coastal GasLink consultation process. The groups have repeatedly highlighted environmental infractions to the permit issues with little or no penalties or corrections made. We have not, nor will we ever support the CGL pipeline. So not only are the people standing up to this model of development, but the people are being jailed. They jailed without charge the women. They broke into their tiny home with axes. It's on the internet if you want to watch it. And, you know, and the letter that the chief signed was, you know, what the heck are you doing? You know, there's people dying from mudslides and fires and floods, and you're there arresting people who are trying to show some leadership around saving the environment that just trash, you know, big parts of BC. So they got it right. But, you know, it doesn't stop at jailing. It actually moves into genocide. The kind of genocide that I saw when I was living in Latin America in 1978-79. So, Berta Isabel Caceres Flores was an Honduran environmental activist and indigenous leader, and co-founder and coordinator, of environmental group in Honduras. She won the Goldman Prize for Peace in 2015 for a grassroots campaign that successfully pressured the world's largest dam builder to pull out of this huge dam. She was assassinated in her home by armed intruders at midnight after years of threat against her life. A former soldier, and this is important to note, with the US-trained Special Forces units of the Honduran military, asserted that Caceres' name was on their hit list months before her assassination. As of February 2017, 3 of 8 arrested people were linked to the US-trained elite military troops that are trained in Georgia, the School of the Americas. There's been quite a bit written about the School of the Americas, how deadly they are, and how they have often killed hundreds of indigenous people in this past decade. So this is the level that the state will go to criminalize our people internationally, and to jail and silence our people locally. And if anything's going to happen to change that, it's going to be because citizens stand up and say enough is enough. We can't do it alone. And I've always maintained that, you know, the building of these linkages are really important in the long run. So I'm going to just briefly talk about 3 organizations that I work with that are really doing something about social change and mobilization. And the first one is the Indian Collective. And Indian Collective formed out of the XL pipeline business that erupted a few years back, where, you know, the police force went in and water sprayed people and arrested. And I met some of those young people. They were primarily young Indigenous and white people that came as allies. And, you know, I spoke to this one young guy about a year ago. We were at this conference together at Hamilton at McMaster. And he said, you know, I was on the front line. I just got out of jail 4 years later. And he was clearly traumatized. And I said to him, I said, well, what do you know, how are you coping now? He says, I don't think I'll ever be the same. But he said, I would do it in a second again to stand up. And it was pretty brutal, the treatment that those young people got there. And in fact, a young white girl was actually killed on that battle line. And, you know, again, I say that this is the extent that the state will go to put a clamp on any activity that questions the state, particularly around energy policies and practices. But Indian Collective is an Indigenous-led organization dedicated to building Indigenous power through organizing, activism, philanthropy, grant-making, capacity building, and narrative change. We are creating sustainable solutions on Indigenous terms. Our mission is to build the collective power of Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations, to exercise our inherent right to self-determination while fostering a world that has been built on a foundation of justice and equity for all people and the planet. Indian works to transform systems, shift power, and generate sustainable solutions through 3 core strategies. And those 3 are defend, develop, and decolonize. Those are 3 principles that I put at the center of all my own teaching. So we defend Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations to defend and protect our land, air, water, and natural resources. Indigenous people, communities, and nations are developed in a regenerative and sustainable manner based on our values and connection to land, culture, and identity. And finally, to decolonize. Indigenous ceremonies, cultures, languages, and the ways of life are revitalized, recognized, and celebrated. And the 4 areas that Indian Collective focus on are climate justice, racial equity, education equity, and land back, which has been a movement that's been developing for decades and is an issue in our province. And it's been really interesting because it's been embraced by groups like the National Farmers Union and good-minded farmers in our province. So it's mobilized a lot of people. So we have 4 land back campaign demands. The first one is to defund white supremacy. We are aware that white supremacy is again mobilizing, and it's taken some fairly serious turns. We understand that there are 64 white supremacy groups in operation in Canada. And this is concerning, and because I don't have to tell a room full of Jewish people about the history of white supremacy and what it can do to peoples. And so we are very vigilant. We are aware that these groups are forming, and we have got fight back strategies. So one of them is, of course, to defund white supremacy. And it's not just only hate groups, but it's like police forces. Like, we need to really start to question what the heck police forces are doing in our communities. They're getting greater budgets, they're becoming more militaristic, and they are also clamping down on social justice movements. So these are concerning. So the mechanisms and systems that continue to disconnect us from stewardship of the land, including police, military, industrial complex, prisons, and the criminal justice system, ICE, and part of the returning Indigenous lands to Indigenous hands is to require that there is consent for free and prior informed consent to development on lands. And I'll tell you, it's anything but that today in our homelands. Development companies go into our communities and they create mayhem and mess and turf, it's really terrible, clear cuts. And I can't tell you the impact on our homelands and on our berry patches and on our large moose populations. And it's a crisis on the land, and it's largely goes back to the development policy. So we have a right to free and prior informed consent. And wherever possible, we try and make, the partners of industry adhere to that, but we don't always win. We need a lot more people on board. I want to just say a little bit about CCPA. I've been kind of shirt-tail relative to this group, but I know Jim has done really tremendous work in that area. I love this group because of the work that they do on policy. And policy, as you know, is a very important piece of research because it can lead to better practices in development. So I have made some very good colleagues that help me to understand about the whole area of economics and how, Jim Stanford says, like, economics is really very simple. If you can run a house, you can be an economist. Of course, it's not that simple, but he did help me to understand that these are concepts that need to be understood by the young, future citizens that are going to be the leaders. I have a joke with my students. I say, when I'm an old woman, I want you to be taught on how to build with policies. So you take care of me when I'm an old woman. And they just laugh, but they know that I'm serious. So anyway, I think that CCPA is really important in that area. And if you have any bequests or extra money at the end of the year, you could maybe help them. Okay, so my final group I just want to say a little bit about is Sea Change Canada, and they operate from these principles. They reclaim the power of food. I teach a lot about food sovereignty, and I believe food sovereignty and food security has the capacity to unite all of us. And if we can understand food sovereignty as a human right, we can change the world. And it's not too late. It's getting very late in the day because, we've lost so many species. We know that there's corporate interference in seeds, in what's it called, how scientists can go in and
genetically modified.
Genetically modified, thank you. And when I did my PhD in agriculture, I was failed at that level in my comprehensive exam because I wanted to look at the impact of genetic modification on traditional indigenous knowledge, plant knowledge, and they said, you're out of here. And they failed me. So I said, well, I didn't need this PhD anyway, and one of my colleagues heard what happened to me in agriculture, and she came swooping in, she says, you're gonna finish that PhD. I said, I don't need it. She said, no, but we need you. And so she kind of, got behind me and salvaged my work in my PhD, and then I got it. But, it's also an example of how far the state will go to try and keep control on these patents on life, and it's serious business. And it's all about power and control to support the industrial food system that is increasingly being less nutritious and more control of our communities. So I encourage everybody to, as Sea Change Canada, reinforce farmer-led solutions. I know my family here supports the local, what's it called, G? When I went and picked up your vegetables that time. Anyway, yes, that one. Yeah, so I know my family is really supportive of these initiatives by local farmers. Keep biodiversity alive so that, there's going to be that beauty for the children coming after us, and advocate for system change. We defend farmers' rights and work for food sovereignty. We're calling on public development banks to stop funding agribusiness companies that take land, natural resources, and livelihoods away from local communities. And finally, I'm going to close with Grassroots Global Alliance, Justice Alliance. And this is a globally based organization that works with Indigenous people, small farmers. And I love their motif. And they describe how they work with these 5 simple steps. They fight the bad, they change the rules, they move the money, they build the bigger we. they build the new, and they change the story. And I think that that is such a lovely motive to have. It's very simple, but it's kind of like munchable. You know, you can understand those concepts on how we do it is up to the community on how we do it. And they do it through energy democracy, food sovereignty, and reinvesting in our personal power, taking our personal power, stop being sad, mad, but really meeting with the community about what is to be done, as Rose and I always say, what is to be done. So I'm going to close with a quote from a woman called Dr. Rupa Fish. She says, "All ancestries rising. No one left out of the circle." Usually when I give talks, I like to meet in a circle, but COVID is different. "This is what the oldest redwood on the peninsula told me. It is time to gather all into the circle to build another way. The changes are coming hard and fast now. It is time to gather to create the resilient systems that will carry us through. We can't vaccinate our way out of this." And she's brilliant, and her latest book is also written by her partner, he's an East Indian food scientist. And it's coming out in August, and I hope everybody gets to read it and learn from Dr. Rupa Fish. Thank you for being here, and on a cold night. And maybe we could take a few questions.
Microphone.
Thank you, Priscilla. I didn't hear the word reconciliation in your talk. I'm curious about that and what your thoughts are.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. In fact, I didn't really talk a lot about the stuff that you hear on TV, because frankly, it's really not very inspiring. You know, our people have a concept of reconciliation. It starts with a W-R-E-C-K, reconciliation, because they don't include the word truth in that discussion. And before we have reconciliation, we need truth. And I think what we're saying is the governments at various levels aren't being very truthful. And if they're going to abide by their rhetoric, it's because good people ask them to or demand that they do. And it's not just about reconciliation for us, but it's for future children. You know, is it the kind of system that you want your children and grandchildren to grow up in, one of inequality and racism? So we've got a lot of business to do with government. You know, they're famous for putting reports out there and then having them sit on shelves, and they've produced a lot of them at great expense. But the quality of life continues to deteriorate. So, yeah, I think it's really about a examination of democracy. What is a democracy? What does it look like in real terms? And what is citizen responsibility? How do we engage? How do we demand the things that need, rectifying and correcting? And these are answers that come out of groups like this, that bother to organize and meet and discuss. Yeah. So, yeah, reconciliation is rhetoric.
Yeah, you take another question? Hi, I'm Joel Kevin. Nice to meet you across the microphones.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So, this small Winnipeg organization of secular Jews and others willing to hang around with us, I've been doing some reflection on sort of what should we be doing or focusing, especially with regard to networking and connecting with others who share general missions of social justice and all the kinds of issues that you've talked about. So a phrase that goes with this organization, we didn't make this up, it came from the national organization, was that we are a progressive voice in the Jewish community and a Jewish voice in the progressive community, which is open, I guess, to interpretation. Long-winded way of asking you, what advice would you give us about how to effectively collaborate with, partner with, network with Indigenous organizations and people here in Winnipeg or elsewhere that can be kind of mutually advantageous as I guess good collaborations can be. I don't know, does that make sense what I'm asking you? I'm sure it's something you've talked to your mother-in-law quite a bit about, but maybe you could share it with us.
Well, you know, I always am more than happy to have a large classroom of students. And there's never any question about their role in social change. They want to jump in. Like, these are young people that come to our classes in Native Studies. We have actually quite a large percentage of non-Indigenous students in Indigenous studies. But we're also always underfunded, and you know, the biggest classes, and you know, there's less and less support for the faculty at universities, as we've discovered here at U of M, you know, just ending the strike sort of maybe today. But you know, I don't think there is any one answer. I don't think that, I mean, I think, I don't know how it happens, but I do know that as an individual, I join other groups just so I can learn from them. And I would also say there's tons of excellent books out there that you can read and get educated about the true history of Canada. There's groups that you can join, and you know, there's the Aboriginal Centre here in Winnipeg. And Helen, help me. Helen always says, thank God my mom didn't call me Priscilla, because her last name's Settee too. Maybe you could mention some of your work in the Ministry of Education? Is it department or ministry?
Yeah, well, I know that there's a number of different groups. So,
Maybe
Remove the mask.
yeah. Yeah, Priscilla's related to my husband, but and she's related to my guest as well. But some of the work right now that we're doing in the ministry right now, where I work in Indigenous education, is around one of the major initiatives we're working on right now is getting more elders and knowledge keepers in schools. Because one of the things we're finding is that many of our elders are passing away, like even pre-COVID and like even during COVID, and not only by COVID, but even just by illnesses in our community. You know, we have a very high number of people living with diabetes and sort of finding more instances. So the ones that are left here, we want to get them more involved in school, in classrooms. People who have that traditional knowledge, people who have the language, our language. I gotta know if you all have your language, you know, in your culture. But I know for us, that's a real area that's really needed to, you know, those who speak the language fluently, is we want them more in schools, the ones that have that traditional knowledge as well too. So we're working on getting more elders and knowledge keepers in schools, and so that's one of the things that I'm really happy about that we're working on. We're also working with a lot of different organizations, post-secondary institutions around language strategy. Because one of the things that we're finding is like within organizations and school divisions, a lot of people are doing kind of the same work. We're developing the same resources. So we're a whole bunch of us, was a table of 15 of us that said, well, if you're developing these resources in this language at this level, then we'll develop this at this level, and this, so that way we avoid duplication, and we can have more resources in our schools, and we're sharing. Everybody's sharing now in our languages. You would have heard of that like 10, 15 years ago, where people were more competitive, and now we're all collaborating and working together around our languages, which is so critical, so important for us. And so that's part of what we're looking, some of the work that we're doing. We're developing as well too right now an Indigenous languages, Indigenous inclusion strategy, which really talks about, first, we're talking about authentic involvement, of getting more people in our schools, more people who, understand, our worldviews, and helping children to understand that, not only our own children, but all children in the system, because all children also need to know more about us. Treaty education is another big area, helping people to understand the treaties and the treaty relationship. You're all treaty people. A lot of people don't think that. I know we ask sometimes people, how many of you here are treaty, and one or two people will raise their hand, but you're all treaty people. Because, the Crown signed treaties with the First Nations. And so we're really helping people to understand that. Somebody asked me the other day, well, why do we need to teach treaties, and why do we need to teach treaties in the classroom? Why is it important? And my response to them was that treaties are foundational to history in the making, and how those treaties were signed, through our ceremonies. When the treaties were signed, our way of signing was not through pen and paper, but was through smoking our pipes, our traditional pipes. They're not called peace pipes, but our traditional pipes. And so if you ever have a chance to look at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, it's not really blatantly stands out, but you'll see that there's a pipe in there. And the pipe is what was our way of saying we will uphold and work, with the Crown related to our treaties. So just those things where we want all children to learn about the treaties and the treaty relationship. So we wanted to train teachers, all teachers, about that. And so we've set some really aggressive targets to train teachers in the classroom. So those are just a few things we're working on.
When the XL pipeline exploded, or the issue, some of the biggest supporters financially were Robert Redford, Mark Ruffalo, like big names, that came out and said, we believe in this cause. It's not just about Indigenous lands and Indigenous rights, but it's about the future of the world. And so that's how the Indian Collective actually organized, was the non-Indigenous philanthropic community came forward literally with collections of millions of dollars, and they formed, they backed up financially this Indian organization. And it's a tremendous youth-led organization that focuses on land back. In Saskatchewan, there are farmers that are giving or selling at a modest price the land back that was stolen from our people. So land back's been a big issue, and our premier's going nuts selling Crown land. First of all, it's not Crown land, it was named Crown land, and they have control and mineral rights to it. And in the meantime, the original land claim settlements have not been honored or settled. So the premier is busy selling land off to rich, faceless landowners, usually or sometimes from different parts of the world, and it's a trend that's happening throughout the globe of land grabs. And it's all being done against people of color, small farmers, women, small, people who know the land and know how to grow food on it. But it's also being sold to faceless corporations, so people can have more red meat or more soy or more whatever, palm oil. And I think that these are issues that ordinary citizens can question, like, where did this food come from? who put that lettuce on my plate? In Canada today, there's this marvelous food justice movement that comes out of Ontario and BC, and it represents the concerns of the small growers that are brought in from Jamaica, India, Mexico, are treated with very terrible conditions, living conditions, no good medical conditions, no citizen rights at all, but yet they grow the food that we Canadians eat. So there's something wrong about that. That's something that ordinary citizens can really talk about. Where do the foods come from, and are they grown under just conditions? It's food justice is what it is. Same for small farmers in this province. Like industrial agriculture companies get huge subsidies from the federal government, but the same it's not the same for small farmers in this province. So I think food is a really interesting issue to get mobilized around. And we're going to have to do it into the future if we're going to have these good foods available. We're heading for a crisis, is the truth of it. So there's myriad ways, to get involved and to claim your citizen rights back.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you very much.
Inspiring that all those scary things you talked about were balanced by all the amazing steps that ordinary people in this room can take together. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.